All right, welcome everyone. We're in the home stretch of the fall semester of material text. I'm Zach Lesser in the English department. I organized the workshop with John Pollock, the Kislak Center, Jerry Singerman, Humanities Editor Emeritus of Penn Press, and Priya Nambrath, who is the Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text, and make sure that everything runs smoothly. And she will, with John's help, be passing around a sign-in sheet, which we hope you will sign into, not for any surveillance reasons, but just so that if called upon, we can demonstrate how many people showed up and from what a wide range of parts of the university and beyond. If you are not on our listserv and would like to be, just add your email to the sign-in sheet. If you're on Zoom and would like to do that, you can send a message to Priya in the chat. You can also go to pennmaterialtext.org, where you'll find a link to sign up. And also there you'll find a database, a searchable database of talks in the workshop that goes back 30 years. I see some people feel like I haven't seen before or in a long time, so welcome. You're always welcome to come to 1, 2, 3, all of the semester's talks, whatever you like. There's no ceremony to stand on. Tonight, we're really excited to have Penn's own Marco Aresu to speak with us of FIGS, the acronymically delightful Department of Italian and Germanic Studies. I feel like the department's going to be 50 years old and everyone's still going to be joking about the new name. Marco earned his laurea in Italian literature, comparative literature, and classics from Cagliari University in Sardinia. I was about to say his home country, but that gets into a whole other. He came to the US to pursue an MA at Indiana University and then another at Stanford, followed by his PhD at Harvard. He taught at Wesleyan University as assistant professor of Italian and medieval studies until 2023, when he joined Penn, and he's been a fixture in this workshop since then, but usually 2 rows back over there. In 2023 as well, Marco published his first book, Manuscript Poetics, Materiality and Textuality in Medieval Italian Literature, with Notre Dame Press. The book studies the material texts of 3 key works of the period, Dante's Vita Nuova, Boccaccio's Tesseda, and Petrarch's Canzoniere, showing how these authors used scribal culture and material manuscript design to reinforce the poetics of their texts. The relationship between author and scribe, he shows, might be competitive, as in the case of Dante, who attempted to restrain the freedom of the scribes who would copy his Vita Nuova by writing its form into the text itself. It didn't work. Or it might be collaborative, as in the copies of Boccaccio made at the Este Court in Ferrara, which dutifully incorporate the marginal and interlinear commentary that Boccaccio included in his holograph manuscript. But more often than not, as with other manuscripts of the Tesseda and with Petrarch's Rerum, as Aresu writes, readers and patrons often determine book forms more than authors did. This book has been praised for being insightful, richly detailed, and marking a reference point for future studies on this essential relationship between the text and its material production. Marco's published numerous articles on medieval Italian literature and manuscript studies, and shortly after he arrived at Penn, he was instrumental in the arrival of MS 2196, which is on the table, a previously unknown 15th century Florentine manuscript of Petrarch, which he's been working on with Nick Herman of the Schoenberg and Kislak Centers, and also with his colleagues elsewhere who constitute the I'm going to say it. Do you say it more like archive or more like Petrarch? The Petrarchan. The Petrarchan. The Petrarchan. A digital edition of the Canzoniere with which Marco has been centrally involved, supported by a major NEH grant, as things sometimes used to be. This combines textual editing and book history to give readers a new understanding of the key Vatican manuscript of Petrarch's poems. Marco is also the new editor-in-chief of Biblioteca Dantesca, the journal of Dante studies run out of FIGS, the Penn Libraries, and the Price Lab. So we might be working him a little too hard. And finally, I'll conclude with a comment from one of his students at Wesleyan, who says on Rate My Professors, you wouldn't think lectures on a 14th century theological treatise could be funny, but Professor Aresu manages it. As funny as he is, Marco is also insanely knowledgeable on all things Dante. So with that recommendation, please join me in welcoming now to the front of the room to talk about Scribe 106.
Thank you, Zach, for this very generous introduction, which will no doubt contribute to my already overinflated sense of self. Thank you all for being here. Tonight, I will present the manuscript production of Scribe 106, a Florentine scribe active in Florence in the 1470s, the third and fourth quarters of the 15th century. And I will begin the presentation proper with a brief overview of the corpus of roughly 20 manuscripts he transcribed, and then focus more closely on those in which he copied Petrarch's vernacular poetry. To better appreciate the version of Petrarch that he delivered to his commissioners, or more likely, to the ateliers in which he worked, and to illuminate the textual and material interpretation of Petrarch that emerges from this scribe's work, I will preface this second part with a short digression on Petrarch's theory of poetry as it appears in the poem's autograph, the manuscript of the poems as written in Petrarch's own hand. Finally, time permitting, I will address the question of Scribe 106 identity. Before I turn to the actual subject of my presentation, I would like to proffer a brief update on an unrelated manuscript housed here at the Kislak Center, right there. My first talk at the Kislak Center nearly a decade ago was devoted to this very manuscript. It is a Florentine copy of Giovanni Boccaccio's Teseida, an epic poem in octaves that many of you will recognize as the principal source of Chaucer's Knight's Tale. The codex was produced in Florence before 1400, the year in which its scribe Adriano de' Rossi breathed his last. And I'm particularly fond of this manuscript, so fond that it actually ended up on the cover of my book. Among the many notable features of this rather homely codex is a spectacular note of possession in mercantesca script, the script that the mercantile class created for business purposes and then also used to transcribe the text that they were reading. And here's it. This book belongs to Bartolomeo, son of Tommaso, who, though love had faded, found it again only for the love of Sister Erasure, Sister Kina, and the delightful, love-filled Sister Isabetta. The appearance of nuns in a Boccaccian setting is, of course, intriguing. Nuns do not sit on their hands in the Decameron. The erasure in this context is suspicious. Despite what became a mild obsession with this Bartolomeo, I was long unable to find more about him, unsurprising given that any Florentine family at any time seems to contain at least 5 Bartolomeo di Tommasos. All I could infer about Bartolomeo came from the manuscript itself, leisurely consumption of vernacular literature, and from this very subscription, mercantile class because of the script, respectable scribal skills. At the most recent conference of the American Boccaccio Association, however, a calling for Notre Dame presented on a manuscript of Boccaccio's Filostrato, a narrative poem in octaves that many of you will recognize as the principal source of Chaucer's Trojan Crusade. And you're welcome for Boccaccio's contribution to the development of English literature, by the way. Among the many points of interest of this rather intriguing codex, now in the Staatsbibliothek Berlin, features a double note of possession. And here's the first. This book belongs to Bartolomeo di Tommaso, flask blower or flask seller, gonfalon of the Chiavi, San Giovanni district, parish of Sant'Ambrogio in Florence, which is much more information than one needs in a way. We're still a long way from a monograph entitled The Vernacular Library of a Medieval Flask Blower, but we can now say with some confidence what book sat next to our Teseida on Bartolomeo's shelf. We know precisely where he lived and where possibly the book was kept. we know he was familiar with and even tried to reproduce certain scribal conventions, such as the guide letter. You should see here and here and here, the Q questo. And from the second note of possession, beyond settling any lingering doubts about his identity, we also learned that Bartolomeo enjoyed fabulating the paratext. This book belongs to Bartolomeo di Tommaso, flask blower, and to all lovers. Bartolomeo was a flask blower, and he was also, it seems, a teddy bear. But tonight is neither about Bartolomeo nor Boccaccio, and I think you miss both of them. And I already know you will miss both of them. Of the Teseda and Filostrato codices I just mentioned, we know exactly who the scribes were, Adriano de' Rossi and Onofre di Giovanni. The identity of the scribe I will focus on tonight, however, remains a matter of speculation, despite the fact that a remarkable number of manuscripts have been attributed to him. In Albinia della Mare's New Research of Humanistic Scribes in Florence, published in 1985 as an integrated supplement to Anna Rosa Garzelli's two-volume Miniatura Fiorentina del Rinascimento, the scribe appears simply as number 106, with some complications in the appendices. Della Mare's magisterial study encompasses more than 2,000 manuscripts and just over 100 scribes, shedding light on the many agents involved in book production in Renaissance Florence: authors, scribes, illuminators, binders, stationers, commissioners, patrons, readers, and collectors. And when I say just over 100, I should really say 106. Our scribe is quite literally the last one listed in the census. I first encountered 106 while I was investigating the identity of the scribe who copied a manuscript of Petrarch's vernacular poetry, recently resurfaced from a private collection and acquired by the University of Pennsylvania in 2024. I once received an email from either Nick or Lynn asking me, if we buy a Petrarch manuscript from the 15th century, are you going to use it? I think so. As those of you who have bravely worked through Della Mare's catalog know, the essay's encyclopedic thoroughness contrasts sharply with its somewhat less than user-friendly design as a reference tool. The two volumes were published without indices. The only way to consult the census of scribes is by hunting page by densely printed page through the listing of hands and their outputs. And there, at the very end of this typographical gauntlet, sits 106. Della Mare, of course, didn't list Penn's Petrarch. She was unaware of its existence, but the paleographic and codicological similarities between this manuscript and the roughly 20 manuscripts copied by Scribe 106 confirm the attribution beyond reasonable doubt. The scribe's output may be divided into two main categories. The first comprises Latin classical texts described in humanistic book form, with Cicero especially well represented. Manuscripts of this type typically adopt a medium-small format. Think of small folio or large quarto. Employ a humanistic script, either the Antiqua or a humanistic cursive, and they use an ornamental programs derived from late Carolingian models. These manuscripts present a full written page with central text and margins noticeably narrower than those of contemporary university textbooks, whose generous margins accommodated scholarly commentary. By the latter half of the 15th century, these manuscripts also characteristically display epigraphic capitals in their titles and rubrics, and they're not very visible here, but yeah, they are. The humanistic portion of Scribe 106 corpus yields several observations relevant both to the scribe's working habits and to the nature of the books he produced. First of all, accuracy. He is, on the whole, a careful and competent copyist. Errors are comparatively infrequent, and most identified and corrected in situ. I represented some of his correctional and emanational practices here because they recur also in the Petrarch, which means that he was devoting quite the philological attention to the text he was transcribing. So his emulatory techniques are consistent throughout the corpus and are consistent with Florentine practices, rely on subdots of expansion interlinear and marginal corrections or additions, use of asterisks, or rather, this is not an asterisk, it's a lemniscos, which is like a percentage sign, to indicate, in this case, integration, variants given in the margins, alternative readings. I have to try and close this. In this case, the word concilium in other manuscripts reads presidium, and al, the L with the flask, means aliter or ali, and we have the same here. There are also some diacritics that I was very unsure what they meant in the Petrarch, but they're very easy to understand in the Latin works. The sort of O or ring above a noun in the vocative always indicates a vocative, which is like quite an interesting point, at least in Italian philology. And I didn't really want to indicate any correction here, but I love the little guide letter that the scribe left for the rubricator. So I just thought I would show it to you. In several of these instances, it is difficult to determine whether these interventions are by the scribe himself or by a contemporary editor or early reader. What is evident to me, though, is that the scribe and his workshop are delivering philologically sound texts. And this is also true for the Petrarch manuscripts, and I won't go in detail with the Petrarch. He demonstrates solid command of Latin, but appears reluctant to engage with Greek. And you can see blanks here left with Greek words. In one case, there should be emphatikoteron. He loves me very emphatically. In this case, I don't know anybody more political than you, politikoteron. And the scribe is either reluctant to transcribe because he doesn't know Greek very well, or his antigraphs, the copies from which he was transcribing, also have a blank. Many medieval manuscripts in lieu of the Greek have a quick note: Grecum est non legitur. It's Greek, can't read. And so the blank and the empty space is sort of transmitted in the tradition. Now, it is peculiar to me that nobody in 1475 had a copy of the Cicero with the Greek. So I think that it was just like not very well versed in writing Greek, and we will see that in the Petrarch manuscripts in an unexpected way. This is also, I think, an important element to determine if all of the manuscripts that de la Mare attributed to the scribe are actually his. Because in some of the manuscripts that are uncertain, also in terms of their paleography, we have some Greek in the same ink, and I would think in the same hand of the scribe. Considering these books' objects more broadly, the book's decorative apparatus is generally restricted to the title page, a framing border featuring bianchi girari, neither of these cases, unfortunately, or a phytomorphic frieze, a historiated initial incorporating an authorial portrait, and in the bas de page, a clippus within the frame that was ordinarily intended to bear the commissioner's coat of arms. The frequent emptiness of these clippae suggests that that possibly the codices were produced as part of a series rather than on individual commission. That is, they were not bespoke manuscripts. They were just producing a number of manuscripts and then hoping to sell them. Little did they know that in the 1470s, something else happens that sort of interferes with the market of manuscripts. The heraldry would be added only upon purchase by an eventual owner. Importantly, the illumination in these volumes is for the most part attributed to Francesco d'Antonio del Chierico. It would seem like these books are the outcome of a coordinated project between a scribe's atelier and an illuminator's workshop. And to be completely honest, I know very little about the illuminator and or about illumination in general, but there's an expert in the audience and he worked on specifically this illuminator. The second portion of Scribe 106 portfolio consists of texts in the vernacular, with Petrarch predominating. The only non-Petrarchan texts are the two that I indicated in red. One is an allegorical poem in praise of Lorenzo de' Medici by Bastiano Foresi, possibly our very scribe. And this is a Protesto di Giustizia, an inaugural speech for new consuls in Florence. Everything else is Petrarch. And it is at this point that I would like to momentarily digress from Scribe 106 production and spend some words on Petrarch's editorial project of associating the poet's activity with the scribes in an ideal coincidence of literary expression and inscription, text and book. Petrarch intended poetry, the very act of his textual enunciation, to be an indissoluble unity of scribal and discursive practices. And I should like to add that any serious investigation of the relationship between textuality and materiality in Petrarch's writing must not forget to make preliminary mention of Armando Petrucci's and Wayne Story's fundamental contributions to the field. And most of Petrucci's work is in Italian. If you don't read Italian, first of all, what's wrong with you? Second of all, there's one major work, Readers and Writers in Medieval Italy, that will help you get comfortable with Petrucci's work. And then Wayne Story's work is difficult, even if it's in English, quite frankly. Petrarch always showed an ostentatiously dismissive attitude towards his own lyric production in the vernacular. And yet he dedicated some 25 years to organize his vernacular trifles and self-styled fragmented souls into a cohesive literary work and a coherent exemplary self-representation. The 366 poems that Petrarch collected into his songbook detail an existential parable of conversion from the poet's protagonist's sensual desire for his beloved Laura to the final entrusting of his soul to the Virgin Mary. The Rerum vulgarium fragmenta, fragments in the vernacular, the title Petrarch gave to his work, portray a poetic subject divided between self-deception and the search for a better version of himself, between celebration of Laura and condemnation of his beloved Laura, and condemnation of love for her as a deviation from love for God, between sensitivity to the fugacity of time and perception of eternity, between secular authors and sacred texts. The poems counterfeit a temporal progression through a series of internal oppositions between past and present and the dissemination of texts, the anniversary poems, that establish the fictitious chronology of his relationship with Laura. The canzoniere, the songbook, as the fragmenta are often referred to antonomastically, employs a two-part structural division to materialize this dilemmatic existence and the succeeding ideological renovation, his mutatio animi. In the first part, the poet clings to the ever-elusive mirage of concluding his erotic quest, reaching poetic glory, and achieving existential contentedness. In the second part, and I hate to break the news to you, but Laura dies. The one thing that happens in the canzoniere, but one action. Laura's sudden death contributes to his intellectual maturation, promotes his conversion, and locates within heavenly grace the only source of existential serenity. And the final word of the canzoniere is, in fact, pace, peace. The dialectic between the coherent textualization of the poet's persona and his fragmentary and ephemeral existence corresponds to one between the unity of the book project and the variety of its style and metrical forms. 317 sonnets, 29 canzoni, 9 sestinas, 7 ballads, 4 madrigals. The tormented elaboration of the Rerum vulgarium fragmenta ultimately results into the 72 parchment folios organized in 11 quires that now form manuscript Vatican Latin 3195, preserved in the Vatican Library. The Codex is the result of the collaboration between Petrarch and a young scribe and man of letters, traditionally identified with as Giovanni Malpachini, who was a guest at Petrarch's house in Venice between 1364 and 1367. And this is a schema of the Vatican Latin 3195. And in brown is Malpachini's hand, in blue is Petrarch's hand. And these are blanks. With few exceptions, the codex is therefore partially autograph and partially ideograph, transcribed under Petrarch's direct supervision, something that I wouldn't wish to my worst enemy. With few exceptions, Malpachini is responsible for the writing of folios 1 through 38, and again, when he comes back, 53 to 62, produced in the spring of 1367. And the other folios are in Petrarch's hands, And again, importantly, those folios are blank, and they create a material division into 2 sections. This material bipartition of the autograph is further underscored by the elegantly decorated Incipitarian letters of Sonnet 1, Voi ascoltate il rimastarsi il suono, and of Canzone 264, Ivo pensando e nel penser massale. Petrarch's scribal activity on the Codex was sporadic in the final years before his death in 1374, but notable among his late interventions are the brown Arabic numerals that appear in the right margin of the first line of the last 31 poems. And you see them here in the margin, and you see them here in detail in a closer look. These numerals reorder the sequence of the poems after the late addition of 2 new bifolia. The renumbering of the sequence leads to the assumption that manuscript Vatican Latin 3195 has slowly shifted from copy, fair copy, to service copy, a working draft. It's the last version of the Canzoniere just because Petrarch died. It's not the definitive version, because some of those little numbers have been erased. We read them with Wood's lamp, but this was not the final reorder, probably. In the autograph, the visual architecture of the page, the distribution of texts and blanks, the mise en texte and the mise en page reflect a specific poetic design, what Wayne Story labeled as visual poetics. That is the interconnectedness between the poetic text and its layout on the folio facade. Petrarch's visual poetics in the autograph depends upon a 31-line facade. The primary textual and material configurations that appear on the autograph's pages are the sonnet page, one side of a folio that contains 4 sonnets, each written on 7 lines and each separated from the next by a blank space. So you read line 1, line 2, line 3, line 4. The other major page template is the sonnet plus sestina page, separated from, Furthermore, Petrarch assigns to each metrical kind a different materiality of written signs. Sonnets, canzoni, ballate, and madrigals feature an overall horizontal alignment. They are distributed into columns with 2 or less commonly 3 verses per line, separated by an intercolumniation here, which is substituted by punctuation in the case of 3 verses per line. The reading of these poems proceeds first horizontally, from left to right, and then vertically. The mise en page de sestina, on the contrary, is characterized by a distinctly vertical orientation, whereby each verse starts a new line. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. The reader first proceeds vertically down the left column toward the bottom of the folio, and then moves to the right column. the individual poems in their visual, material, spatial articulations, and the various material combinations that the poems assume at the level of the folio and of the book opening, the 2 pages in front of you, are direct emanation of Petrarch's artistic project. And I will provide 2 concrete examples of both levels, the level of the folio facade and the level of the book opening. I've mentioned that the autograph of the fragmenta displays the 14 hendecasyllables of each of its sonnets on 7 lines, with 2 hendecasyllables on each line. And the reading proceeds first horizontally from the odd verse on the left to the even verse on the right, and then vertically, 1, 2, 3, 4. Following textual styles codified in Renaissance canzonieri, modern editions present instead Petrarch's sonnets in the thoroughly vertical layout, 1 verse per line, to which we're now accustomed. But with sonnet 25, which is here, Amor piangeva ed io colui talvolta, love from whom my steps have never strayed, used to weep, a thoroughly vertical layout dismantles the acrostic structure of the poem, a structure that forms the word amore, amor, also the sonnet's incipitarian word, with the opening letters of the odd hendecasyllables of the sonnet's fronte. A reading of sonnet 25 that disregards its layout in the autograph fails to recognize Petrarch's project of transcribing texts in meter-specific spatial formations. And I realize that, like, the canzoniere is not about acrostics, and like the job is not like, let's hunt for acrostics. But hey, this is a major Gothic feature of Petrarch's work, like the manifestation of the articulation of the text. I'm using Gothic in Panofskian terms. And also, if we extend this to all figures of order like anaphora, anadiplosis, chiasmos, we clearly see things differently than if we read the text in a thoroughly vertical layout. And the major point is that it's Petrarch who's doing this. He is maximizing scribal conventions for aesthetic purposes. The second example that I want to give you happens at the level of the book opening. These are 45 verso 46 recto. In the autograph, Sestina 237, non ha tanti animali il mar fra l'onde, the sea has not so many creatures among its waves, and Sestina 239, laver l'aurora, si dolce Laura, are transcribed symmetrically. This symmetrical mise-en-page conforms to a material aesthetics that centers on the visual unity provided by the 2 folio facades of the book, verso recto, open before the reader. An aesthetics à livre ouvert, to use Léon Gilisson's formulation. The visual and textual correlation of these 2 folios side by side corresponds to the dialectical relationship of thematic correspondence and opposition between the 2 sestinas. Both sestinas re-evoke the protagonist's youthful errancy, but the protagonist striving to put an end to his erotic agony in Sestina 237 gives in to new delusions of poetically appeasing Laura in Sestina 239. The symmetrical presentation of the sestinas, in other words, is further visual argument for the dilemmatic quality of the lover's existence and poetry. The orderly, textual rendition and material presentation of the poems in manuscripts transmitting the canzoniere indicate facts, modes, and phases of its history. And a combined analysis of material and textual aspects of manuscripts allows us to form hypotheses about the modalities of reproduction, transmission, circulation, but also reception and interpretation of the text itself. The autograph is the ultimate, if not definitive, result of Petrarch's frantic, decades-long activity of composing, transcribing, correcting, collecting, rejecting, ordering, reordering his poems. But between the initial conception of the book and the last traces of Petrarch's scribal activity on the autograph stand several versions of the canzoniere. The more than 200 codices dating to the 14th and 15th century, and we have about 600 codices of Petrarch's canzoniere. Nothing like Dante's 850, but still, the more than 200 codices from the 14th and 15th century preserve at least 4 or 5 different editions of Petrarch's songbook. If the autograph's textuality proved crucial for determining an authoritative text, because emanating directly from the autograph, the manuscript edition of the fragmenta documents the various phases of its composition history because it transmits the various versions of which Petrarch himself was the intellectual originator. And Petrarch was always like, oh, the commoners, I don't want them to read my work. But he was giving away manuscripts, often subpar versions of those manuscripts, because everybody wants to be read, and everybody wants to be loved. What is more, during the proto-diffusion and early circulation of the canzoniere, the complexity of the autograph's textual and material strategies did not prove easy to reproduce serially. Only the autograph itself and a few manuscripts for the late 14th and early 15th centuries preserve Petrarch's sophisticated system of mise-en-texte and mise-en-page. The manuscript edition presents a different material execution and visual poetics of Petrarch's work, a different interpretation of his work, one that gradually streamlines Petrarch's various textual styles into the one that we now know. And in a census of the manuscripts that predate the type of manuscript that our 2196 represent, that is to say the new humanistic book form in Littera Antiqua, Marco Cursi, an Italian cricologist, found that only 11 out of 40 manuscripts actually followed Petrarch's mise-en-texte and mise-en-page. A remarkable example of material nonconformity to Petrarch's editorial program in Manuscripto Ricardiano is Manuscripto Ricardiano 1088, a paper codex of 70 folios dated between the end of the 14th century and the beginning of the 15th, and preserved in Florence in the Biblioteca Ricardiana. The Ricardiano is written by one main hand, who starts transcribing the poems of Petrarch's songbook in two columns, the odd verses on the left and the even verses on the right, like it's the case in the autograph, with a significant exception of the sestinas, like it's the case in the autograph, which are copied in a single column. But after folio 26 verso, a sudden change of pen, ink, and layout occurs. Halfway through his transcription, the copyist places the often cited dramatic testimony of his scribal resolutions. From now on, he tells the reader on folio 27 recto, he will discontinue the practice of following different layouts for different magical genres, distancing himself from Petrarch's conventions as he knew them from the antigraph before him, and as we know them from the autograph of the Rerum vulgarium fragmenta. Instead, the copyist will uniformly transcribe of any type in the same format, one verse per line, proceeding vertically. And I quote, I don't wish to continue writing the same way I've done so far, that is, switching from one column to the other. Instead, I plan on writing down one column until either the canzone or sonnet is complete. And yeah, two manicule here kind of notice this dramatic, very dramatic scribe. Drops by, please. An urge for standardization and simplicity here replaces a more respectful approach to the mise-en-page of the exemplar of Petrarch's authorial and authoritative editorial decisions. Poeta variat, librari iterant. The poet varies and opts for specific solutions, where our copies repeat and tend to uniformity. The Petrarchan production of Scribe 106, back again to him, represents the fully developed expression of this tendency towards standardization, simplification, and serialization. And I should add that most of these manuscripts were identified by de la Mare, coming from the same scribe, except for Philadelphia, of course, Turin, and Siena. Siena was Siena and Florence were recently identified by a researcher from the Istituto Università Orientale di Napoli, of Naples, Daphne Grieco, who shared many of the reproductions with me very generously. This corpus exhibits a set of recurrent features, and I will skip the intense editorial activity that you can notice in the manuscript through various diacritical, because enough. They share the material. All codices are copied on parchment. They share the format. The volumes are uniformly small in size. And I'm using as a category the taille, the semi-perimeter, the sum of height and width, which is consistently under 320 millimeters. Whereas the autograph, and this is already a major distinction, lies at the threshold between the medium small and the medium large categories. They share the same fasciculation. 10 of 12 codices are composed of quinions, quires of 5 bifolia, yielding 10 folios per quire. They share the same ruling, which is this model of ruling. It's a type of hardpoint ruling corresponding to model 36 in the Rollet classification of ruling schemata. And by the way, this should be that drawing is from De Rollet, but stands in lieu of the Vatican Chigi L4 114, which is another copy of the Canzoniere, but because God is almighty, but looks like he always needs money, the copy was too expensive to reproduce according to the priests' standards. The size is also very different. The folio count derived from the combination of both the fragmenta and the Triumphi, the other vernacular text by Petrarch, is relatively homogeneous across the corpus. And variations result chiefly from differences in the execution of the illustrative apparatus and from the inclusion of certain paratexts, which, when present, add at least 2 additional quires to the volume. And the 3 most common of these paratexts are the alphabetical index of the poems, Leonardo Bruni's Life of Petrarch, and Laura's so-called obituary, which is presented, which is an obituary note that Petrarch left on one of his favorite manuscripts, his Ambrosian Virgil. And here's the note in Petrarch's hand. But in these manuscripts, it's presented as a letter that Petrarch wrote to Laura, often is given in the vernacular and in Latin, and that he left in his house in Rome, house that Petrarch never had. And anyways, this is just to give an idea of how we move from a minimalistic canzoniere in the autograph, minimal illustrative apparatus, no paratext, no marginal commentary, not even the numbers of the compositions, to a sort of more complex series of texts scattered around the name of Petrarch. They, of course, share the same illustration, or rather, type of illustration. In the vast majority of cases, the decorative program can be attributed to Francesco d'Antonio del Chierico and or artists from his workshop. Their contributions of varying quality and palette consistently feature the same iconographic motif on the title page. Apollo pursuing Daphne at the moment of her metamorphosis into a laurel tree. And this myth is foundational in the Canzoniere because Apollo is Petrarch, Laura is Daphne, and also the poetic laurel, also poetic glory, and so on and so forth. And as you can see, sometimes the product is more pleasant to the eyes than others. The manuscripts also share, at least 8 of the 12 manuscripts, materially split the fragmenta into 2 parts, like the autograph. But they do so in a way that I think Boccaccio would have found at least objectionable, which is by using a Dantean rubric, incipit vita nova iusdem Petrarche. The new life, the Vita Nova, the first of Dante's work, begins of the same poet. Now, Petrarch is the poster child of Harold Bloom's Anxiety of Influence. So he repeatedly mentioned that he never read Dante until very late in life, and only because Boccaccio gave him a manuscript Vatican Latin 3199, and it was like it was too bad to like waste the opportunity. Whereas we know that Dantisms in Petrarch are just like so many that they can be barely counted. In some other cases, there are minor variations on the same formula, like just vita nova here or finis vitae veteris, end of the old life. All of these manuscripts also share the closing formula telos, the end, or similar forms placed at the end of a work, which is not the way that telos should be written. This is a morphological, non-grammatical distortion of the Byzantine closing formula telos, which was clearly becoming widespread in northern Italy in the last quarter of the 14th century, or the 15th century, and so the scribe just did it. Am I going with time? And finally, which is probably the most striking aspect of this Petrarch, it should by now clear and very evident to the eye that our scribe does not preserve Petrarch's original layout, and he probably never had access to it. He does, however, work toward a harmonious presentation of the text on the folio facade. The scribe appears to pursue a series of complementary objectives in the mise-en-page: to reconcile the textual substance of the poem with their physical extent, with their material extent, achieving an ideal coincidence between text and page, and to organize an aesthetics, again, of the book opening, informed by principles of symmetry and mirroring, so that the two facing pages display a spatial arrangement of the poems that is congruent. Also contributing to this mode of presentation are the variable spacing between poems, usually 2 blank lines, but the number vary. In this case, is trying to finish the poem by the end of the folio and making the end of the poem coincide with the bas de page. The use of fillers, like in this case, or the use of, again, variable blank corresponding to several lines in order to get back to the more easily manageable series of 4 poems, 2 per folio facade of the book opening. The flexible distribution of the verses of a single poem across the pages, allowing the poem to be contained within 1 page and bringing the explicit closer to the bas de page. And in this case, he copies 31 lines on 1 page, 32 on the other, 33 on the other, and again, 31 on the final page of the same poem, which also gives way to his transcribing above the first line and really beneath the ruling proper. So below the last line, he's trying to contain the poem within the page, and at the same time trying to create a symmetry between the 2 pages. It's a sort of opportunistic choice to write a verse above or below the line. And this orientation in transcription is further confirmed by this example. The distinctive foliation that he gives in red Roman numerals, at least in one of the examples, the theory exemplar, which marks not the individual leaf, but the book opening. That is, the same Roman numeral placed above the first line designates the pair of facing pages. This is 15. It's not like 15 verso, 16 recto, but the book opening has the same number. Like this is how the page is conceived. I won't go on the identity of the scribe, which is like a problem in and of itself. But even without a name, Scribe 106 emerges with surprising distinctiveness through a cohesive corpus, consistent, even predictable habits, and recurring collaborations. His manuscripts allow us to reconstruct a meaningful presence within the Florentine book world, with far more confidence than his anonymity might suggest. His manuscripts identify him as a purposeful, decorously methodical, stylistically unified agent in late 15th century manuscript production. In copying Petrarch, Scribe 106 joins the wider cultural migration away from the autograph sophisticated manuscript poetics layouts that are standardized, towards layouts that are standardized, efficient, and reassuringly reproducible. His codices exemplify a manuscript tradition that preserves with reliable fidelity the verbal substance of the poems, but streamlines their material form, though cheerfully transforming Petrarch's metrical, spatial, and book-level design into a more uniform and humanistic mise-en-page and book product. Within this tradition, Scribe 106 stands as a representative figure, at once transmitting Petrarch text and participating in the broader systemic reimagining of how the fragmenta should look, function, and be read. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcos.
And I'm not taking any questions.
We are open for questions. Just a reminder, if you're on Zoom, to use the raise hand function and we can call on you to ask your question live, or you can put the question in the chat if you prefer.
Shall I keep the presentation on?
You want to
Just like that. Yeah, without sharing screen. Yeah. You can see them. Great. Liliana.
Thank you so much, Marco, for the wonderful presentation. What you have given us is, in some ways, a picture of a competition, but a competition that is not concurrently, but delayed, of Petrarch, not just writing, but presenting his work, and the scribe writing and presenting the work differently. And I wonder whether you can say something about the reception of Petrarch that has followed, if I understand you correctly, more the standardized way of 106 than Petrarch's way, which hasn't been widely known. And you even suggested perhaps not even known to 106, which makes me think, how does he standardize something if he doesn't know or what?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I would say that the competition is real already in Petrarch's time, and it's almost an adversarial relationship that Petrarch has with scribes of his age. He's a major exponent of a graphic reform that leads from the what I find the beautiful Gothic script to more sort of open and aerial semi-Gothic forms that incorporate Carolingian elements, because he dislikes the way that books look, first of all. Second of all, the competition emerges in the fact that he tries to condition and control the reproduction of his canzoniere by creating archetypes, and I'm using archetype in a medieval sense as a text a copy that is being approved by the author to be circulated among a circle of friends and copied according to the standard of the exemplar. When the type of work is so difficult, so sophisticated, and the relationship between form, content, and material organization is so inherent in one another, the job is difficult. At the same time, you have the much easier model of Dante's poem in terza rima that can be easily copied one verse per line, which pretty much makes for an easier model to copy, which influences also the way that you transcribe other authors. And you also have to add the role of classical poetry, especially epic poetry, as hexametrical poetry that is generally copied one verse per line. So the distancing happens before our scribe, and our scribe probably doesn't know about that. But there's still a major difference between reading Petrarch in the autograph and reading Petrarch in a humanistic book form or in print. The fact that he doesn't know about that doesn't mean that he's to blame, but the fact that we know about that and we still read Petrarch just in the model that is being standardized in Renaissance canzonieri is a little less legitimate.
Just add a point of irony. If Petrarch says that he is not reading Dante, the scribe is making Petrarch look like Dante.
And I should say, Petrarch doesn't say I never read Dante because he never calls Dante by name. There's only one reference to Dante in a marginal notation where Dante is actually called by his name, and the reference is contra Dante. This is against Dante. And he is actually agreeing, I think it's a passage by Macrobius that stands in stark contrast on something that is spelled out in the comedy and Petrarch. All right, so this is against Dante, but he never calls him by name. Jerry.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marco. As a former publisher, of course, I would much rather be producing as a printed book your scribe's version of the canzoniere than trying to do this rather wacky, imposition on the page of some single columns, some double columns where you have acrostics, and it's a much, much more complex layout. And it does strike me that the layout that you have presented moves very easily into a print edition, and probably the kind of print edition not only that we're used to, but that we want to see with, neat quadrants of poems on the page. So, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the transition from manuscript to print of the canzoniere. And one striking thing in particular is that, let's say, at the end of canzone, when you have blank space that you need to leave various spaces blank so that you can pick up again the kind of neat quadrants of the sonnets. Are those kinds of spaces picked up in the print editions as well? So what is the imposition of the poems in print, and how do they relate to the imposition of the poems on your manuscripts?
Good question. Thank you for your question. First of all, there's an edition of a printed edition of Petrarch every year from the Editio Princeps, which is in 1470, the Vindelinus edition, that is not based on the autograph. The 1472 edition is based on the autograph, but it doesn't reproduce, it reproduces the text and the diacritics, but not the spatial organization. So we have one verse per line. And the most common Petrarch among incunables is, first of all, when the two works occur together, Triumphi and then Rerum, vulgarium, fragmenta. And it is surrounded by commentary. It is generally in quarto edition. We have a copy there, the 1490 Piero Veronese edition, I think, surrounded by Filelfo's commentary. So the organization, I think, is the type of university desk text with commentary that is not necessarily easier to reproduce, but certainly is not as complicated to reproduce as a text that is oftentimes in 2 columns and sometimes in 1 column. Of course, the edition that really makes the history of Petrarch in print is the 1501 edition by Aldo Manuzio, curated by Pietro Bembo, which is self-professedly based on the autograph, but it's not. Only at a very late stage, Bembo could collate his copy, his work copy, with the autograph. And it has 1 verse per line, minimal margin. It's a Petrarchino, and the Petrarchino is apparently based on a kind of book product very similar to ours. That is to say, San Vito's scribal production of Petrarch's work. It's a small format, 1 verse per line, minimal margins, in a humanistic script. So very easily, Petrarch becomes a book of things.
Can I just jump in, because
I don't know if I answered your question.
first of all, there's an interesting tension between the ease of layout and the paper, right? With the Petrarch's own layout, you could fit maybe 3 sonnets on a page compared to 2. But clearly, this other scribes and the printers prefer the ease of design, even if it uses a little more paper, which I think is interesting. But even the way you're talking about 1 or 2 verses per line, I think the tension between, or whether we can discern a difference, or is there a difference between verse and line, is interesting. And it seems like Petrarch's own layout is very interested in the tension between book design and formal poetic design, that is, between verse and line. Or the sonnet's not even 14 lines in, or is it 7 lines? And the Petrarchan form, the 8 and 6 is transformed here too. So you gave the one example of the acrostic, but that's obviously an unusual. They're not all acrostic. No, so that's a good example to show the difference. But aside from something like that, why do you think he wants to do that? Like, what is he doing? What is he getting out of the 7-line format that, presumably he would not like to see it in the scribal, in Scribe 106's format is not what he wants. But so what is he getting that he's not getting in the other form, do you think? If you can infer something.
2 important details, I think I should add. The 3 most ancient canzonieri of Italian lyrics, the Palatino, the Vaticano, and the Laurenziano, write sonnets in that form. Occitan chansonniers writes poems, except for cases of very elongated manuscript, like oblong manuscripts. They write poems like prose, and the end of a line is determined by a punctus at the end of the line. So that, first of all, there's the tradition, and there's no foundational study of the passage from horizontal
Continuous
towards vertical layout. Like there's no major study about that, but you can certainly see that the vertical layout is presented as a way to emphasize the metrical scheme, the rhyming scheme, the rhyme scheme. The case of the sestina with like 6 rhyme words representing themselves in according to the crucifixion and retrogression of the verse is a clear case. Like in that case, the rhyme scheme is what really matters. I think when you are writing and following like we can use a category like that of implied book, which is the book that the author must have had in mind based on his scribal codicological competence, and therefore the way that he was envisioning a reader, an implied reader, at the end of the process, deciphering the sort of syllabic chain. And at that point, it is very important if a word is at the beginning of a verse or in the middle of a 2-verse series. Yes, we can, like we call an Alexandrine, like we call a double septenary, an Alexandrine, we can probably think of a double hexasyllable as a verse form, but the key point is that what appears in the page, the key point is that poetry in the Middle Ages, and I think in general, is just not an oral, verbal entity. It's also a visual, material, spatial entity. And I would even say 3-dimensional. I prefer the idea of a manuscript poetics, not because I thought of the term compared to visual poetics, because manuscript poetics is an idea of the 3D dimension of perusing a book and reading poetry. And the sestina, and in particular, sestina 142 and the double sestina 332 in the canzoniere, actually require that you turn the page in order to complete the reading. So it's not just like going up to see if the rhyme scheme works, or like to understand the rhyme scheme, a very peculiar and unusual rhyme scheme. You have to turn pages to actually see if the metrical pattern is respected. There's a sort of element of the reading happening in space and time that is, I think, enhanced by that type of use of the page.
Yeah. But what the comparison with the sestina is really interesting, I think, because what it suggests is that for Petrarch, and the sestina is such a fancy virtuosic form, the line and the emphasis of the repeated varied words in the sestina at the end of a line shows that for Petrarch, that form is really important to highlight. Whereas in the sonnet, the things that we tend to read sonnets, maybe I'm just coming from the English tradition, but like the rhyme is not that important. So you can see a difference in Petrarch's understanding of what matters in the poetic form of the sonnet versus it's not that it's not important. I mean, you still have you still perceive the rhyme, but it's in the sestina that he absolutely wants to preserve the kind of coterminous ending of metrical and scribal form, right, or textual form. Whereas with the sonnet, and again, I can't think, Peter will correct me, I can't think of it on the Zoom. I can't think of an English sonnet. I mean, I don't know of any example of an English sonnet laid out that way. And also it would seem very odd because of the nature of the form of an English sonnet to lay it out that way. But that seems not to be true for Petrarch. Maybe because everything rhymes in Italian anyway. It's not as impressive as a sestina, to rhyme.
It is like metrics and metricology in Petrarch, an author who has been called the legislator of Italian metrics. It's certainly interesting, and the sonnet has a variety of metrical combinations in Petrarch that are that have a semantic value, obviously. I would take your approach the other way around. The sestinas are eminently visible in the canzoniere. They immediately stand as specific marking points within the book, and they are used because of their retrogressive metrical form as I would say places for reconsideration, meta literary reflection, examination of the past, They have a specific function within the narrative, and also in terms of meta literary poetics that is very Petrarchan, or at least mine, my reading of Petrarch, that the sestina enhances by occasioning this abrupt shift in material presentation. So it's not like, what is he trying to highlight with the sonnet? The sonnet is the standard. What is he trying to highlight with that vertical disposition? I think.
Evita, and then we'll go to Peter.
So I want to go back to Scribe 106 and talk about the regions of the page. I mean, what struck me was that in terms of the page numbering and the layout, and Jerry was getting at this too, what you said was that he was planning for the open page to balance, you know, where the poem started, where the illuminated letter would be, and that in the Petrarchan autograph, it seems like the division between the two verses is kind of imminent. It's a teeny space. It's not a column. And when you showed the where the scribe, you know, was shrieking and saying, "No, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm," you know, he was actually trying to put it into a column, which is a different thing than just leaving a couple of, you know, M's between a period and the next letter. And so he was dealing with different regions of the page. But what Scribe 106 seems to be doing is, you know, jumping over this chasm of the gutter, you know, and making those two things one, even though they had to have been separate objects. And in the printing, they would have been, you know, they would not have been seen as one page. And so one of the things I'm interested in is, was that an innovation on his part of 106? Were there other people who were thinking of this open page, bound but united, you know, as one thing? Were there other people who were doing that, and did that have any influence on other scribes? Or that's kind of the question.
And it's a great question. Thank you. And first, a minor detail on Petrarch. The two hands in Petrarch's autograph, the hand of Malpagini, under who and Petrarch was like supervising him, so he was doing exactly what Petrarch wanted. He was living with Petrarch. The intercolumniation is kind of movable. Whereas Petrarch always starts the second verse of the line at the same, it's justified in a way.
Okay.
Justified to the left. Our scribe scribe's activity is consistent with that of many 15th century Petrarchini. And I haven't studied them. I've only focused on 106, but he is definitely one of many. And he's one of many within a corpus that also allows for larger formats, even when they're not following Petrarch's Petrarch's textual style. And often you have a combination of textual styles that doesn't necessarily reflect Petrarch's autograph, or is indebted to them from a thematic point of view. But
I mean, it seemed like he could do that because he knew they were sonnets, you know, and he knew how long they would be, you know. So if he was dealing with other kinds of material, one would think he wouldn't be able to achieve that exactly.
You make me think of, again, Dante's Vita Nova, in which poems are often not only divided, but described in metrical terms before they're actually listed after the prose, so that the scribe actually knows what they are going to transcribe, and they organize the page based on the metatextual indication that is embedded in the text and is embedded in the narrative of the text. And then I wrote this sonnet, and here's the sonnet. And the scribe already knows how to organize that sonnet. I think there's a clear attempt on behalf of Petrarch to give a sort of a piece of total art that invests all aspects of book production. I think it's a very delusional way to think of one's own autograph in medieval scribal culture, which is not only an open source sort of culture, but it's also I copy for passione, not just to sell or to circulate the text. So that inevitably brings about different textual styles for different texts, for different audiences that couldn't care less about Petrarch's ideal of graphic reform, to use Petrucci's terminology.
Peter.
Thank you so much, Marco. I mean, it was a wonderful presentation. Thank you for your book. You know, it's a fabulous book. I want to go back to Liliane's question, which is that there seem to be two different projects here. One is, which most we've been talking about, is manuscript versus print. But Liliane's question was about the relationship between the scribal and the authorial within manuscript culture. And so the first question is, I mean, I presume that the 7+7 must have a very straightforward level, and the notion you're saving on parchment, you know, that as a scribal thing, you're using much less parchment. And so that once you switch to printing, you're dealing most of that. This combines both things in a way, but once you switch to printed copies, even though Aldus Manutius is sometimes printing on parchment, the great majority are on paper, and the expense is so much less. You know, you're not, I think people have exaggerated the cost of paper at the expense. You know, there really is a big difference between parchment and paper. But also picking up on Zach's question, I mean, and also on what Jerry was saying, I mean, it does look to a modern eye, this is the way to put it. I mean, 7+7 just looks weird. And that if you're brought up, you know, particularly in the English tradition, sort of what you do in Poetry 101 is you contrast Petrarch and Shakespeare. So the Petrarchan sonnet is 4 + 4 + 3 + 3. And you can actually see that in, you know, you always, and that goes through into Philip Sidney, for instance. He uses a variety of rhyme schemes, but they're all signaled in the visual layout. In Shakespeare, you get the notion of 12 + 2. And so there's an epigram, you know, a rhymed epigram at the end. And again, that's always visualized. So all of Shakespeare's sonnets, you always indent the last two lines as an epigram. So in a way, what Jerry was asking is, to us, to put it bluntly, I mean, Petrarch looks like a bit of a disaster. In other words, he doesn't get it, whereas the scribes do get it. You know, I've actually, you know, the scribes get what a sonnet should look like. And, you know, I mean, so in some ways, the question is, should we hear it for the scribes a bit more? That's the first question. The second question is about punctuation. Certainly when it comes to things like plays, which there's many, many differences, certainly in England, but I also think it's interesting when the first manuscript I know of in England, which is very, very carefully punctuated, is a translation of Orlando Furioso. So it's a manuscript that very, you know, in English, but absolutely with authorial punctuation. The tradition in drama is that basically most dramatists don't seem to punctuate often at all, no punctuation. And so there the actual the process of developing punctuation goes first of all from printers then to scribes, and then only finally to authors. Authors do start punctuating, but nonetheless, punctuation is nearly always expected certainly in England anyway, to be done by the printer. You know, the printer makes up their mind, and and to a certain extent to this day, you know, there are house rules very often for specific printers, so that I'm just interested whether there's anything going on with punctuation. So that's the question.
There's a lot happening in punctuation. Petrarch has a very specific system of punctuation that consists of punctus, punctus elevatus, comma, virgula, and it's not necessarily reflected in the critical editions that we have. Even the allegedly most conservative critical editions that have absolutely no issues changing Petrarch's punctuation to sort of give a Renaissance version also of the syntax and often of the lexicon, an easier version according to our standards as modern readers. And you know, I like to cite again Wayne's story here at the end of what I'm saying. No, I think we should read Petrarch according to Petrarch. And I think that is the sort of ethical duty of philology. And then we have no issues with modern Renaissance. Renaissance as modern is a little funny. With Renaissance interpretation of Petrarch. The important thing is that we know what the agenda of the editor is when we're reading a text, because we are always reading a text that somebody else prepared for us. So we're seeing what somebody else wants us to read. We are incredibly fortunate with Boccaccio and Petrarch to have the type of text that the authors wanted us to see. And yes, we don't have the ultimate interpretation, and then the author died, as many obituaries about authors in the 20th century told us, and the death of the author is the birth of the reader. But we do have as one of the voices, the authorial voices in terms of punctuation. And I think a sort of even non-diplomatic, but sort of philological approach to that punctuation should be preserved. And I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And thinking about the history of sonnets, so when Petrarch is writing sonnets, when Petrarch's sonnets are first copied out according to his rules, and people don't really know what a sonnet is, right? We know that it's the 14 lines.
We've known what a sonnet is.
When Petrarch is writing the Canzoniere?
Yeah.
Okay. And so the disposition, and so people would know that it's a 14 line, that it should be 14 lines?
Yeah.
You know, I'm thinking,
I mean, at least 14 lines, and there are variations like sonetessa, sonetti caudati, but like the metrical form is neatly organized at the court of Frederick II, and then the three most important anthologies of Italian literature of the origins, which is pretty much, if you get rid of those, we have 1/5 of Italian literature of the Duecento and the Trecento, the 13th and 14th century. But they're already like metrical treatises in the late Middle Ages that circulate, that certain terminology circulate. So they know what a sonnet is. Then Petrarch determines that a sonnet can only be one way, but they know.
okay, but he's determining that a sonnet can only be one way, and that's what we understand as the Italian. I mean, the Shakespearean sonnet is different from the Petrarchan sonnet, but I don't know. There's when just one curious marker of the sonnet as Petrarch wants it written out is if his rhyme scheme is A, B, B, A, in his 2-line transcription, the ends of the lines don't rhyme.
Yeah.
Is that unsettling?
No, maybe the rhyme is less important than the
Yeah.
polarization of a particular word at the beginning of
So, but that's telling us that the rhyme is not what you're supposed to be looking for when you're reading the sonnet the way Petrarch wants it to be
it's a way
copied.
it's a way to put it. I should probably inquire more into that. It's a way to put it. It's not like we don't have sonnets written by Petrarch in the fully vertical mode. In his draft codex, for example, some of the sonnets are written vertically when there is a sustained anaphora, and the anaphora needs to be made more visible. I have a sonnet in mind that he directs to a musician for the sonnet to be put into music, and probably that's the reason why he chooses that format. But even when he's like drafting sonnets, not just for fair copies, he goes 2 verse per line. And like I don't mean to be polemical on this, but the assumption almost seems like, I mean, there's Shakespeare, and we should go backwards towards Petrarch, whereas we have like a very legitimate way of presenting sonnets by an author who's a very legitimate poet. And maybe we should start reading the way that he was asking us to. And then we can do whatever we want. But once again, I discovered this type of layout when I went to Indiana University and I had the opportunity to study with Wayne Story. Before that, even in the most common critical editions that you use in college in Italy, just not much about how poetry is organized visually and materially. So,
but even the example you use there, I mean, kind of reinforces the idea that when he's writing a poem that's emphasizing a rhetorical trope like anaphora, which is to me closer, say, to the sestina than rhyme, right? He lays it out vertically. In other words, rhyme is not something that's going to make him lay it out vertically. And that, you just what I mean? Like sestina is a very complex form. He wants to emphasize anaphora. He wants to align the rhetorical form with the visual. But rhyme doesn't need that kind. Now, I think also there's something about oral versus written here, because of course, if you read the poems aloud, the rhyme is there. It's not, you know, if you're thinking also of reading aloud, the rhyme is perfectly there. You don't see it at the end. It's not in the end of the line doesn't show the rhyme on the page, but you hear it just as well, right? So, but it is interesting to me that the poetic feature that does not demand the kind of end stopped, highlighting is rhyme, whereas sestina, I mean, anaphora is coming at the beginning anyway, but that demands a kind of verticality. I don't know if there are others, that you could, that he does do. In other words, I may be making up this taxonomy, but is it true to say that when it's simply rhyme at stake, he does the 7-line version, but he moves to the vertical when there's something else going on that is, let's say, more kind of pyrotechnic than rhyme?
I'm thinking, because you mentioned the ABBA, which is the most common in Petrarch for the most common scheme for the quatrains, together with AABB, the very rare AAAB is used once or twice, I think. In the terza, it's a mess. I stopped counting the number of combinations. But even in the AABB, you don't see the rhyme at the end of you don't see the rhyme at the end of the line. You still see it at the end of the verse, even if it's not in column. Like, you see it. It's not like it's not there, and it's marked by the intercolumniation. It's just like I think it's a good way of challenging the type of interface that we're most accustomed to think in this way, and like to see if he's prioritizing this dilemmatic construction of the verse, the most important words being put at the beginning and the end of the line. and not just the rhyme scheme, the sound, and the effect to the eye.
You see, it seems to me that there are two ways of developing signification. And one is valorizing rhetoric, and the other one is valorizing a taxonomy that traditionally has been much more valorized than rhetoric, because it was relatively recent when rhetoric has become has been understood as a way of thinking. So what I appreciated so much in your talk, Marco, is precisely the fact that you are putting together these two things. You are not separating them, and you allow this double layer of signification, double layer of meaning production that ultimately go together, but they are also a different way of producing sense. Am I making sense?
This is the famous third way of making sense. Yes, absolutely, and I think what is outstanding in Petrarch's autograph is the compenetration of the various levels, including the material and the visual, in the production meaning. And yes, it's a very peculiar case of autograph and author's book, again, as Petrarchan calls these autographs. But they're there, and they don't stand they're not an obstacle to interpretation, because we are used to other ways of deciphering that. I think they have a value in themselves because of that.
It's the opposite of an obstacle. It's like, I would bring one of these in to students, you know, what's a sonnet? The first thing they say is it's 14 lines. Well, here's the, you know,
here's what the master's
here's the birth of the son, you know.
And I will end with the, no, I will not end. I'm still here. But I will mention the quote that that I had in mind by Wayne Story. When you teach language, when do you start speaking Italian in class at a college level? When do you start showing your students what the sonnets are in Petrarch's own hand? Do you wait until they already know that a sonnet is 14 lines, or you immediately get them to work on a different interface?
Peter has,
Okay.
I have stuff to say, but we're out of time.
You could
Peter,
say it
go.
at dinner, but
Yeah.
Peter can't. So we'll give Peter the last question.
Sorry for a second one, but you know, one of the things that it seems to me is so interesting about what you're talking about is really within the whole tradition of Armando Petrucci, of thinking about the book, you know, and what is the nature of this book, and yet the irony is that the fragmenta or the rime sparse, they're scattered rhymes, and I'm just wondering how much Petrarch himself participates in the fragmentation. How many, to what extent is he actually sending off individual sonnets, and to what extent do some of these sonnets get known by heart, which in a way comes back to Zach's question, and to what extent do they become oral and not actually part of a visual tradition at all?
So not all of the poems that Petrarch wrote are included in the songbook, and the number of poems attributed to him that are extravagant is astonishing. And like a conservative approach would count at least 50 extravagant sonnets, but in the first edition of the extravagant poems, some 200 were listed. Petrarch according to Wilkins, a major American scholar called Petrarch, produced the canzoniere in 9 forms. And Wilkins detailed all of the forms with the exact number of poems, the order of those poems based on a manuscript edition. Is kind of dating and distributing the various forms over time has been proven as unfounded because this notion of ink and pen and time at which Petrarch was writing is just like very iffy and wonky. But we tend now to think of forms of the canzoniere when we have a manuscript that actually transmits them. And we have at least 4 or 5 different forms. And we also have letters in which Petrarch tells us both this method of work and also what the addressee of those letters have to expect. In one in particular, he mentions the fact that he leaves blank spaces at the end of the manuscript so that he can then send updates with the last poems to the person that he has sent the manuscript to. In this case, it's a famous letter to Pandolfo Malatesta, Orazio da Correggio, so famous that I forget the addressee. But he then complains that scribes didn't actually do that, so they didn't leave blank folios, and therefore he has to resend the manuscript with blank folios. So he is a major contributor to the mess, the textual mess of his work, even if he's always complaining about the unreliability of scribes and the subpar copies in which he cannot even recognize his own poetry. Once again, complaining Dante, the best of our vulgar poets, for the fact that he is read out loud in bars and in piazzas, something that he wouldn't want for himself.
All right, well, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Do come look at Scribe 106's work on the table.
No, much more important to hear from the experts.
Just the pen.
No, it's